Analysis. Well, we've been discussing the elections in Iraq. And my studio guest from the first part of the programme are now joined by Paul Schultz from King's College London, and on the line by Colin Freeman, Chief Foreign Correspondent for the Sunday Telegraph. Welcome to the new guests, and let's start off again with you, Anas. We can't ignore what's happening in Syria, and obviously it's having a massive impact in Anbar. Is there anything more to be said about how it might affect the outcome of the elections?
Well, obviously, I mean, it was difficult for people to elect in their hometowns, particularly in Anbar, where those who infiltrated those towns and cities from ISIS or Al-Qaeda or their kind of ilk, causing the government forces to start shelling those towns and cities, claiming to try to run them out, but in the process causing incredible mayhem and causing tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people to actually flee their homes to other remote areas or other provinces. Besides that, I think that we're looking at the entire region, which is in upheaval, whether it be Iraq and Syria and their common borders, whether it be what's happening in the Gulf in terms of creating some new lines of political alliances, the role of Turkey, for instance, which is either receding or growing according to who you're listening to, Iran and its own regional expansion, what's happening in North Africa. I think that we can look at things from a geopolitical point of view, from a strategic point of view, and we can see there many commonalities. What's happening in Syria will have a domino effect on Iraq, but also on other places. We have, Yemen, south of Saudi Arabia, that's in upheaval, and whether it be Eastern Africa or Central Africa. So we're looking at an entire region, quite important because of its minerals, its riches, its wealth, it's also because of its strategic positioning. All seeing a time that, to be honest, could impact anything and everything that we're talking about.
Mayor, is this an issue for the political forces in Iraq in the election? Are they saying we're taking this position over Syria, we're taking that position over Syria?
I think that's the key question. At the moment, it's an internal affair. These elections are about Iraqi politics. Of course, there'll be negotiation about Iraq's relationship with Iran, especially if there's a strong Sunni representation in this government. Of course, they have ministries, as they have 11 ministries as it is. I mean, this is the part of the problem, the sectarian allocation of the state itself. And so the key problem in Iraq is about being able to govern. Anyone in government is not able to govern because your opponent or your enemy sometimes is actually challenging the process to govern. And I'll give you an example of Sadr City. For instance, they wanted to rebuild Sadr City, but they weren't able to because the Sadrists felt that they would lose power and the gain would be to Maliki. But the key question regarding the region, I mean, this is just one example of the internal politics associated with these elections, is to do with Syria. And I think that this is a much more fluidic, the relationship between Iraq and Syria is much more fluidic than we think it is. It's not as concrete as some people are saying. And I think, again, what happens in Iraq will influence that type of relationship between Syria and Iraq.
Paul, so what about the line of causation running that way? What about developments on the elections in Iraq influencing support or otherwise for Assad? Is that an issue?
Not very directly, I think. Because the complexity is that Iran is, apart from Russia, Assad's major backer, and Iran is not apparently particularly fond of Maliki and vice versa. So the Iranian influence after the election will be complicated. So it's hard to know exactly how these dynamics will go. But what I do think will be happening with the violence in Anbar, which is connected with the violence in Syria, is that it will continue the sectarian narrative, the Sunni-Shia split. It's not only Sunnis fighting Shia, but it's perceived very much as Sunni jihadis trying their old tricks again. This will bring most voters behind the party that seems most reliably determined to throttle that, to stifle it, and that will, for many of them, appear to be Maliki, because other Shia parties have flirted with coalitions with Sunnis in the past, and they may pay a price for that in the election. I think this explains Maliki's confidence about how he's going to get a sufficient plurality of the votes to put himself in an impregnable position to form a coalition afterwards. Which is all depressing, because it prevents the development of Iraqi politics in a way which gets beyond the sectarian winner-takes-all.
Well, we'll come back to that point in a moment, but let me just bring in Colin Freeman from The Telegraph. Colin, you know, both Mahir and Paul in the studio just now are really saying that perhaps there's obviously is a relationship between what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Iraq, but it's almost too fluid and complex to call properly. Do you have a more definite view, or do you think that's the case?
Well, I would agree with what they say. On the other hand, we are seeing what seem to be specific results on the ground just this weekend past. For example, one of the major Shia militias in Iraq, the League of Righteous, suffered a car bombing at a pre-election rally, which, as ever, was blamed on Al-Qaeda. Obviously, one of the things that particular Shia militia has been doing recently, which may have partly been responsible for bringing them to Al-Qaeda's attention, has been sending Shia fighters to defend the regime of President Assad. And of course, as we also know, Iraqi fighters from the Sunni side, from the Al-Qaeda side, if you like, are fighting on the rebel side in Syria. So in a sense, you have both players in the sectarian fight in Iraq, also fighting in Syria too. And last weekend, that fight came back to the streets of Baghdad with this big car bombing that very nearly hit the leader of the League of Righteous, Qais al-Khazali. He had to be escorted away, and that sort of direct conflict seems to me to be an example of the conflict in Syria spilling back onto the streets of Iraq, and it's certainly worrying, because the League of Righteous is a very powerful militia. They've got something like, depending on estimates, between 1,000 and 3,000 fighters at their disposal. They gave the Americans a pretty good run for their money when they were there. They are not a militia to be trifled with. This kind of action by Al-Qaeda, very provocative. You can imagine provoking a response from them, which could return us to the old sectarian death squads days that we saw in 2006, 2007.
Mahir, I mean, you were saying earlier before we were on air that that some of the sort of framing of politics within this sectarian divide is now beginning to kind of pall, and that there is perhaps the possibility of some other political forces gaining out the elections. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I'll just briefly speak about that. In 2009, of the elections, there were much more group-based electoral powers vying for the elections. Today, what we've seen is actually a much more fragmented political party effort. And I mean, for instance, even with the Kurds, they would often put in unified lists among the Kurdish political parties for disputed areas in Diyala and Mosul, for instance. Now they're actually putting through individual party lists according to the respective parties. And that is because of the political system within the KRG, and respectively also in Baghdad. For instance, in Diyala, in 2009, there was a unified Shia list northeast of Baghdad province. And so that isn't the case today. And so what we've seen today is actually may culminate in a much type of more complicated, more complex horse trading, because that wasn't the case before. So I think this is what's going to happen. In addition to this point, is that in 2009, people actually voted for Ayad al-Alawi and the political party he represented, which had 91 seats, more than al-Maliki. And they didn't get into power. But the primary reason why they voted for him and the political party, because they were a secular-oriented party. And I think I'm seeing this from what I'm gathering from Baghdad and also from the diaspora, Iraqi diaspora in Europe, America, and Australia, is that there is this sort of search for the secular candidates in Iraq, and I think they're going to do much better than we expect them to do.
Do you think that's true?
To a large extent, I mean, the sort of sectarian religious politics that's been played out in Iraq over the past 10 years, and funnily enough, oddly enough, with even the backing, I mean, this was instigated by the Americans themselves. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld, when he would visit Iraq, one of the first people he would go and visit was Ayatollah Sistani, for God's sake. I mean, what was he doing? So, I mean, the kind of politics that panned out, that seemed, that had the guise and aura of political powers, of religious, sectarian political powers behind it, has been an utter failure. And as a result, people are trying to find something different, and therefore the Medani-lists and others who have that kind of guise of being away from those kinds of politics is something that is attractive and appealing to the Iraqi person who is just sick and tired of what's been seen over the past 11 years. I
mean, Paul, do you think it's in a way, it's a race to get, if you can put it this way, past post-occupation politics before the state collapses?
Yeah, because it is not in good shape, and so many of the factors that you see operative in politics, the corruption, the intimidation, the monopolization of power by anyone who can get it, are going to lead to state breakdown and immiseration. There just will not be enough money to go around, given how badly it's distributed and diverted to private gain. So it is certainly a race against reform and immiseration and state collapse. Whether we'll now see a somewhat more enlightened form of politics and a greater flexibility, I don't know. I'd hope so. There are all the things you mentioned, the fact that the agendas of religiously backed parties have been so murderous and disastrous, and I think Iraqis do understand that. On the other, and the constitutional changes since the last election should give smaller parties more chance to get votes and form effective leverage in coalitions. And I think that's, as I said, hopeful. But against that is fear. If the state appears to be breaking down, if sectarian violence is on the increase again, then I fear that people are going to vote the old sectarian line when it comes to it.
Colin, Paul raised there in passing, and Anas in the first part of our programme raised more forcefully the question of the economic distribution of wealth in Iraq. This is not, as Anas was saying, a poor country, but perhaps even more than elsewhere. Most people aren't seeing it. Do you think we would be better looking at the situation in Iraq and analysing it through the lens of the economic issues as much as through the sectarian divide?
Well, I mean, there's a number of points there. I mean, one, obviously, is that Iraq is an oil-wealthy country. That can itself be a curse, as we've seen in a lot of oil-wealthy countries, because it gives the government a guaranteed stream of revenue. It does not mean, therefore, that the government is dependent on taxes from its people. A government that is not dependent on taxes from its people, therefore, does not need to seek the consent of its people to rule. It has, it can do what it wants. That social contract that binds one to the other is not really present in Iraq. It's not present in a lot of oil-rich countries, and you tend to see the unhappy results. On the other hand, I mean, many of the problems that are currently facing Iraqis, you're talking about a lack of electricity, lack of adequate infrastructure. I think these are not problems that are there because there is a lack of money, but it's the security situation at the moment prevents those problems being resolved. I've heard recently, for example, that they've now built lots of electricity generators everywhere. There are new power stations going up, but the distribution network is not there. The pylons and telegraph poles in local neighbourhoods are not up to the job. That is a huge task that that would test a government under the best of circumstances to start rolling out a better an electricity network to every house and home. Under the current circumstances, where you've got violence as a fact of everyday life, that just makes it very, very difficult.
Okay, well, Anas, let's try and unpick some of that. So, what are we looking at here? We're all agreed it's a wealthy country. The oil revenues are there. Why isn't it getting down to where ordinary people are? Is it one, that the money isn't staying in Iraq, that it's going out of the country to foreign firms or wherever? Is it two, that it's the sort of old neoliberal story for the past generation now, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer? Or is it that the government crisis, that the government would do this, but there's a paralysis in the system which is not allowing it to do that?
I would go with a third contention, and that is that essentially the way in which Iraq was built post-2003 was built wrong. It was built wrong, it was built in haste, it was built by the wrong hands, and with the wrong kind of influences internally as well as externally. Add to that the total porous borders that allowed everyone and anyone and everyone to actually come in and play to whatever agenda they wanted to play, whether it be with arms or whether it be through trade or whether it be through smuggling or whether it be through whatever, left Iraq totally vulnerable to everything that we're seeing today. The political system is not failing simply because, we could make it simple and say, well, there's a lack of political will. I don't think that that's the case. I think that there are enough and sufficient politicians out there who want to do well and who are trying their best to do well. The security situation that Colin spoke of course, it's an important factor. But the most important thing is that the way that Iraq was built post-2003, the way that the Constitution, for instance, was drafted in haste within 3 months by not judges or academics, but by politicians who all came trying to exert their own fears, their own bad experiences into a constitution that was supposed to be for everyone and forever and a day in the life of modern Iraq. That, it was basically, it allowed for an Iraq that is unworkable. However way you look at it, whatever the results and the outcome of the elections, you will see a repetition of 2010, and that is a hiatus of several months, politicians going behind back doors, not even in Baghdad, possibly in Tehran, possibly in Washington, trying to hammer out deals with the exertion and blackmailing of militias on the ground, showing military muscle in order to gain in the negotiation game. It's a system that is unworkable. I wish I could sit here and say, well, it's just a handful of politicians that we need to get rid of and the Iraqis need to get rid of, and then everything will be okay. I don't think that that's the only problem.
So Mahir, is that what you're saying, that the foundations were laid wrong?
I totally concur with that point. And also from the Iraqi side,
of a civil, it's hard to see how Iraqi civil society could possibly work in this situation. But is there a chance of a greater pressure from civil society on the political structure?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. It depends on how we define civil society. If it's the realm of private activity, which it is in Iraq. And in Iraq civil society, it depends what you're referring to. For instance, if you're looking at non-governmental organizations in Iraq, there are at least 2,000 registered in Baghdad. And they have a key role to play in the political process in the non-state space, in the sense that they are able to raise awareness amongst the ordinary citizen regarding the political process, regarding their everyday affairs. And from what I've seen from my experience, that they do play a critical role, but it's not enough given the amount of money in Iraq, given the amount of money coming from outside Iraq to influence Iraqi politics, including influencing Iraqi NGOs. So they do have a key role to play, but it's not sufficient given the enormity of the Iraqi state, because all of the oil wealth is endowed in the Iraqi state, and that's why everyone actually wants to penetrate the Iraqi state, because outside the Iraqi state is a laissez-faire society, is the ugly society, but actually in the state you're safe, and this is why everyone wants to penetrate this state.
Paul, it is very difficult here to see, it emerging into a sort of daylight here, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a line of poetry which I've seen applied to Pakistan and Northern Ireland as well, that what the wrong gods have created, no army can put right. So there is a kind of foundation curse there. But it's not just the Coalition Provisional Authority and the Americans. It was an insistence by Sistani, who was in other respects very helpful and in favour of stabilisation and non-violence, but an insistence that there had to be early elections and there had to be a move towards government by Iraqis, whether you called it democratic or not. And that meant that there was no time. The alternatives of not moving quickly with an imperfect constitution would have been an even higher level of violence than that we saw. So it's that problem and the inheritance of a political, well, Baathism and all the appalling members of that, and under the monarchy there was no great tradition of compromise. The British didn't foster anything beyond a formal parliamentary democracy. So it's a whole inheritance of very authoritarian, utterly non-democratic, non-concessionary history in politics, and that's that. When politics accelerates into mainstream violence, is very hard to get over. There are some very brave and intelligent people in Iraqi civil society, and good luck to them. The trouble is they're likely to be outgunned and possibly killed, but certainly out-influenced by politicians with militias and intimidatory potential.
Colin, do you think that that only a settlement in Syria will give some space for change in Iraq now? Are the two that connected?
No, I think Syria is even if Syria wasn't happening, these problems would be ongoing in Iraq anyway. Many of the people, as I understand it, in Western Iraq, where the trouble is now, much of the anti-government feeling there is all about the government in Baghdad and the perception that it is a Shia or a Shia entity that it takes its orders from Iran. I'm sure your other speakers will have heard these sorts of comments many times before. That I think most of the problems would have been there anyway, maybe not quite so exacerbated as they are now.
Okay, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you just there, Colin, because we've come to the end of this programme, fascinating though it's been, on the developments in Iraq. So I'd like to thank my guests, of course, for being here, and you at home for watching. Please do tune in again for future discussions, and don't forget, you can keep up with the discussion here by following us on Twitter at the address below, or by following the Islam Current Affairs team on Facebook. Until next time, good night.